Hello, today I'd like to talk to you about China. In fact, I'd like to ask a question. Will China dominate the 21st century? Before I start my speech, let me give you some of the terms which are going to crop up. I shall refer to the country's official title, which is the People's Republic of China. I shall mention a former president of China, Deng Xiaoping. I shall also talk about the South China Sea and a group of islands in the South China Sea, which are called the Spratly Islands. And finally, I'll be mentioning the Chinese one-child policy. And my speech will begin now. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no doubt, if you look at the front pages of the newspapers, watch news bulletins on television, or scroll through items of news online, you can see for yourselves that China is on the rise. It's quite clear that China is becoming a very powerful country. To begin with, of course, China is the world's most populous country. Quite simply, there are more Chinese people than any other ethnic group on the planet. The population of China currently stands at over 1.4 billion. Over the last few decades, China has also been expanding as an economic power. As long ago as 1978, the then President of China, Deng Xiaoping, introduced sweeping reforms to the Chinese economy, and it has gone from strength to strength ever since. Indeed, China now rivals the US to be the largest economy in the world. China has enjoyed spectacular rates of growth, as much as 10% per annum, year after year. And we can see the evidence all around us of China as an economic power. It's enough just to visit your local shopping centre and look at the huge array of goods on sale to see that many of them have been made in China. China is also beginning to flex its muscles as a military power. Did you know that the People's Republic of China actually has the largest professional army in the world? Those in active service in the military in China are over 2 million. And if you add to that the reservists, the final figure comes to over 3 million troops. And China is certainly making its presence felt in its own backyard. For example, it is laying claim to large areas of the South China Sea. Now, the South China Sea is very important for strategic reasons. Not least, most of the goods made in China actually have to pass through it on their way to the rest of the world, and control of the shipping lanes in the South China Sea is therefore very important. Quite apart from that, there are also other resources which are up for grabs in the South China Sea. There are, for example, quite large fish stocks, and there are also major reserves of oil and gas, and naturally, China wants to get its hands on those as well. Needless to say, China's neighbours are involved in the same game. They too would like to benefit from the plentiful fish stocks and the oil and gas reserves available. So all countries in the region are vying for control over these resources, and they are doing so by occupying a number of groups of small islands which are scattered across the South China Sea. Indeed, these islands are the subject of dispute between China and its neighbours. One case in point is a group of islands called the Spratly Islands. In fact, no fewer than 6 countries lay claim to the Spratly Islands. China is one, but other claimants include countries such as Malaysia, the Philippines, and Taiwan. China, however, has gone one step further and has actually been building artificial islands among the natural existing Spratly Islands. The idea of building these artificial islands is to establish military bases so that China can prevent other countries from laying claim to the islands. Now, neighbouring countries are, of course, very concerned about this, to say the least, and there is certainly potential for conflict, if not war, in the foreseeable future. At any rate, China is certainly seen as a military threat. Now, if there's one of China's neighbours which feels particularly under threat, it has to be the island of Taiwan. China regularly conducts military exercises in the vicinity of Taiwan, and it is becoming increasingly vocal in its claims over the island. It says that Taiwan is quite simply part and parcel of the People's Republic of China. So, not surprisingly, many people are quite worried by China's rise to power, and they fear its influence over the coming decades. But are we being unduly alarmist when it comes to China? China is certainly a giant, but might it turn out to be a giant with feet of clay? China actually has a number of weaknesses which will play a role in determining the extent to which it might dominate the world stage in future. Now, I don't have time to go into all of them here, so I'll just mention two. The first issue I'd like to address is the problem of demographics in China, and the second is environmental challenges which face the country. So let's start with demographics. We've already heard that China has the largest population on the planet. Indeed, the Chinese authorities did become very concerned that the population was growing out of control, and they took drastic action to curb population growth. They actually introduced a policy, the notorious one-child policy. And the one-child policy was applied with great vigour for several decades, indeed for 35 years in total. Now, the one-child policy did indeed bring down the population, but it also had an unintended effect. It went too far and led to a population imbalance. The result of the one-child policy is that China now has an aging population. It has an ever-increasing number of people aged over 60, whilst the number of young people continues to plummet. In fact, the United Nations estimated that by 2050, China will have over 440 million people aged over 60, whilst at the same time, the number of people of working age will continue to shrink. The government certainly has quite a headache with this. How is it going to find enough people in the workforce who can provide support to the ever ballooning population of retirees? Eventually, the government realised that the one-child policy was a mistake, and so it was scrapped in 2015. In that year, the Chinese government announced that couples would be allowed to have a second child. And indeed, at the time of writing this speech, the Chinese authorities have gone even further. They have just announced a new policy whereby Chinese couples will be allowed to have a third child. I fear, however, that this may be too little, too late, because many Chinese people are reluctant to have a second child, never mind a third one. And the reasons for this, well, they are largely financial, particularly for Chinese people living in urban areas. The cost of living in cities in China is very high, in particular the cost of real estate, and young Chinese couples cannot afford to buy an apartment in cities. The prices are quite simply out of their range. And that's not to mention, of course, the actual cost of bringing up children, which is also expensive. So it's unlikely that this trend towards a shrinking working population will be reversed anytime soon. And so this confronts the Chinese government with a problem. How are they going to maintain the high levels of economic growth which China has seen up to now? The second problem I'd like to mention is that of environmental degradation. And this degradation is affecting the environment in many ways in China. Let me focus on just one of those problems, which is a very serious problem in China, that of air pollution. If you've ever visited cities in China, you'll be all too aware of the problem of air pollution. Cities are swathed in a thick layer of smog, and in fact, the smog is so bad on some days you can hardly see the sun. I don't need to point out that such serious air pollution exacts a huge toll on the nation's health, and it's a big killer. In China, every year, some 750,000 Chinese succumb to the effects of air pollution. And the damage is being done not only on the health of the nation, but is also causing an economic cost. It's estimated that the cost of dirty air to the Chinese economy amounts to 6.6% of GDP every year. Just to give you a comparison, in India, the corresponding figure is 5.4% of GDP, whereas for the United States, the cost to the economy of air pollution is 3% of GDP. As I said earlier, air pollution is just one example of the environmental problems which plague China. Again, I'm afraid I don't have time to go into more detail on those. But what is important is the effect of these problems on society. The environmental state of China is so serious that it is creating political instability. Up and down the country, people are taking to the streets to demonstrate against the effects of pollution, and they are up in arms about the damage being inflicted on their health. So, to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, if China is unable to maintain current levels of economic performance, these problems of political instability will simply increase and become more and more difficult to address. It's certainly the case that China will continue to be prominent in world affairs for quite some time to come, but I'm not entirely convinced that it will become an invincible global superpower which will completely control the world. Thank you very much for your attention.